Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice, and the sound of rain, carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. It begins not with a clang of pots or the scent of spices, but with silence. Behind the towering walls of Topkapi Palace, nestled above the shimmering Bosphorus, time seemed to stand still. Sunlight filtered through arched windows, carved in marble, casting golden patterns onto ancient tiles. Guards stood motionless. Eunuchs glided through hallways like whispers. And in the heart of this palace, deeper than the throne room or treasury, pulsed the true engine of empire, the Sultan's kitchen. To understand the soul of the Ottoman Empire, you must start not with war or politics, but with a plate. Food wasn't just nourishment here. It was power, symbolism, diplomacy, and sometimes even danger. Each dish served to the Sultan wasn't just prepared, it was orchestrated, a performance crafted by hundreds of men who never spoke to their master, yet knew his taste better than anyone alive. The Imperial kitchen, or Matbah-ı Amire, wasn't a simple cooking space. It was a city within a city. By the 17th century, it employed over 1,000 cooks, assistants, tasters, and fire tenders. It had 12 separate kitchens just within its complex, one just for soup, another for rice, another for desserts, another strictly for the Sultan's private meals. It had its own bakery, its own spice storage rooms, and even its own mosque, because the act of cooking here wasn't just physical labor, it was sacred. But food was never just food in the palace. Who ate, what, and when revealed one's status in the imperial order. The Sultan, of course, ate alone. Not even the Grand Vizier could dine with him. His meals were placed in golden containers covered in silk cloth and carried through silent corridors by trusted servants. Before a single bite touched his lips, the food had already passed through layers of scrutiny, tasted for poison, inspected for freshness, measured for balance. A drop too much lemon, a touch too little salt, and it could mean exile for the chef. Or worse, the palace fed more than just the royal family. Each day, thousands of meals were prepared for officials, concubines, guards, scholars, and janissaries. But the hierarchy was precise. A low-level scribe might receive a bowl of lentil stew and bread. A high-ranking advisor might enjoy saffron pilaf lamb in pomegranate sauce and roasted eggplant dripping in garlic oil. The Sultan, he might receive all that, and a jeweled tray of candied rose petals cooled with snow brought down from Mount Uluda. Topkapi's food budget was immense. Every year, tons of rice sugar almonds and spices were imported. Coffee beans arrived from Yemen, pistachios from Gaziantep, dates from Arabia. The empire's reach was its menu. Each meal was proof of conquest. Every spice whispered the name of a captured city. Even the oranges were political. And yet, despite all this grandeur, secrecy ruled the kitchen. Recipes were memorized, not written down. The head chefs, the Ashchebasha, carried centuries of culinary knowledge in their heads. To become one was to spend decades in silence, rising through ranks like a soldier. Loyalty was prized above creativity. A chef who made the Sultan ill, even unintentionally, could be quietly executed at dawn. But not all meals were about danger. Some were rituals of joy and celebration. When a prince was born, the palace exploded with color and smell. Lambs were roasted whole and stuffed with herbs. Halva was stirred in copper vats until its scent floated through every hall. Dancers performed. Musicians played. The air was thick with cinnamon and clove. It wasn't just a birth, it was a performance for the gods. And in this world of measured perfection, timing was everything. Meals were prepared to the rhythm of the call to prayer. Water for tea was boiled just as the sun dipped below the palace dome. Dessert was served the moment the muezzin's voice echoed from the blue mosque. A second too late, and the illusion cracked. Precision was reverence. But why did all of this matter? Because to feed the Sultan was to serve the empire. His strength, his clarity, his health. These were national concerns. A bloated sultan could miss meetings. A sick sultan could be poisoned. An angry sultan unsatisfied by his meal might take it as a sign from God or an omen of betrayal. So the palace kitchen became a fortress. Every bite was a calculation. Every spice a decision. Every dinner a miniature battlefield of loyalty, power, and survival. And as night fell over the palace, casting long shadows over the courtyard, the kitchen didn't sleep. Fires glowed in stone ovens. Knives flashed in lamplight. 100 hands worked in silence, their sweat feeding an empire. Outside, the world saw a mighty sultan. Inside, the cooks knew the truth. No empire survives on power alone. It needs flavor. And tomorrow's feast had already begun. By the time the first sliver of sunlight sliced through the marble corridors of Topkapi, the kitchen was already alive. Beneath the domed ceilings of the Matbah-ı Amire, the imperial kitchen fires had long been lit coals, glowing like watchful eyes in the dark. The scent of freshly kneaded dough, roasted lamb fat, and cardamom drifted like a fog through the complex. The cooks moved like clockwork, each knowing his place, each step choreographed by centuries of tradition. To the outside world, Topkapi was a palace of rulers and ceremonies. But to those who truly understood its beating heart, it was a fortress built around a kitchen. The Matbah-ı Amire was no ordinary kitchen. It was a labyrinth of courtyards, long brick ovens, and arched chambers, humming with heat and precision. Spread across a vast area on the palace's second courtyard, the kitchen complex could feed more than 4,000 people a day. Its 12 main sections operated like guilds. There was the soup kitchen, the rice kitchen, the pilaf kitchen, the dessert kitchen, the bakery, and even a special kitchen exclusively reserved for the Sultan's personal meals, the kushane. Each section had its own master chef, its own hierarchy of assistants, and its own set of sacred rules. Orders trickled down not from a chalkboard or a schedule, but from memory, instinct, and tradition. There were no modern recipes, just the oral transmission of secrets from one cook to another, passed down like family heirlooms. The head of this entire operation was the chief of the kitchens known as the Matbah-ı Amire, who reported directly to the Sultan's steward. In the world of Ottoman politics, he wasn't just a cook, he was a power broker. The kitchen wasn't just massive, it was beautifully designed. Its 12 chimneys formed an iconic silhouette that still stands today, rising above the palace like sentinels. Beneath those chimneys, great copper cauldrons the size of bathtubs simmered with stews and soups. Whole lambs rotated slowly on iron spits. Wooden spoons as long as a man's arm stirred vats of rice and pomegranate molasses. The noise was constant, yet measured wood-cracking knives, tapping ladles clanging against copper, all blending into a rhythm like prayer. And what they cooked wasn't simply food, it was diplomacy in edible form. When foreign ambassadors came to the Ottoman court, they were not greeted first by the Sultan, but by the kitchen. The dishes presented during their reception were calculated political messages. A simple bowl of honeyed almonds might be a gesture of welcome, or a warning, depending on how they were served. Lavish displays of roasted birds, candied fruits shaped like roses, or rice molded into golden towers were not about taste. They were about grandeur. The Ottomans didn't just feed you, they overwhelmed you. But behind all the spectacle was grueling, relentless labor. Many of the cooks were former slaves who had worked their way up through the kitchen ranks. Others were recruited from across the empire, selected for their talent and discipline. Boys as young as 12 began as fire tenders or water carriers, eventually becoming spice handlers or meat preparers. If they proved worthy, they could be promoted to Zadagan senior chefs with the privilege of preparing dishes for high-ranking officials. A very lucky few, reached the Kushane and earned the rare honor of preparing the Sultan's daily meals. And those meals were sacred rituals. Each morning, a meal was prepared just for the Sultan, usually something modest, like a bowl of fragrant rice lamb with yogurt or stuffed vegetables. But the process of getting that meal to him was anything but simple. First, the food was plated in dishes of porcelain gold or silver. Then it was placed in a special covered tray and carried in complete silence through a private corridor. Only a handful of men were allowed to touch the tray, and each had to pass rigorous loyalty tests. The route to the Sultan's chamber was guarded by the Has Oda, the inner circle of eunuchs who served the ruler directly. The food was then presented often with the Sultan eating alone, watched by no one, judged by no one, tasting history on a spoon. Security was paramount. Every dish passed through a royal taster who sampled each item to ensure it wasn't poisoned. The kitchen staff knew one mistake. One slip in hygiene or preparation could cost a life, and not necessarily the Sultan's. Rumors of chefs vanishing after a failed dish were whispered in corners, half-truths cloaked in fear. But the pressure did not crush innovation, it sharpened it. Ottoman cuisine evolved not just through conquest, but through conversation. From the Balkans to North Africa, the empire absorbed culinary traditions and elevated them into something new. A Persian stew became thicker, darker, sweeter, with the addition of dried fruits. An Arab rice dish gained saffron and cinnamon. Greek-style vegetables were now stuffed with pine nuts and currants. The kitchen was an empire in itself, digesting cultures and returning dishes that reflected a synthesis of Ottoman ambition. And yet, for all its complexity, the food remained humble at heart. Even the Sultan occasionally requested the simplest meals: lentils with olive oil, freshly baked bread, a spoonful of sheep's milk yogurt. These moments of simplicity were not weakness, they were control. In a palace where everything was excess, restraint was power. As the sun rose higher above the palace, the kitchen became a symphony of urgency. Trays clattered, flames roared, rice steamed. The Sultan's noon meal would be served within the hour. The men of the Matbah-ı Amire moved faster, but still with purpose. There was no yelling, no chaos, just a current of practiced precision honed by generations. They weren't just feeding a man, they were feeding a legend. And as the aromas curled upward into the halls of power, a truth emerged: no matter how great the empire, no matter how feared the Sultan, even the mighty must eat. And those who feed him, those who toil in the bowels of the palace, unseen and unnamed, wielded a quiet, unspoken power that few could ever comprehend. He ruled the most powerful empire in the Islamic world, with lands stretching across 3 continents. His word could sentence a man to death or raise a pauper to glory. But when it came to his daily meals, the Sultan dined alone, utterly, deliberately, alone. In the Ottoman court, food was not just sustenance, it was a mirror of rank, and for the Sultan, a reflection of sacred isolation. He was more than a man. He was the shadow of God on earth, the Padishah, the Caliph, the Emperor. And as such, even his meals had to reflect divine separation. No one ate beside him. No one saw him eat. Even when surrounded by dozens of concubine servants or advisors, the Sultan's table remained a place of solitude. His meals were prepared in the kushane, the most elite and restricted kitchen of the palace. Only a select few chefs handpicked for loyalty, discretion, and absolute discipline were allowed into this space. These men knew their emperor's habits intimately, even if they never once spoke to him. They memorized his preferences, his allergies, even the rhythm of his digestion. Was he fond of sour cherry compote in spring? Did he avoid lentils during Ramadan? Had he tired of lamb this month and shifted toward fish? They knew. They adapted. They anticipated. The process of delivering food to the Sultan was a silent, sacred procession. After the dishes were arranged sometimes in golden bowls with lids, sometimes in hand-painted porcelain from China, they were placed in a zembal, a covered food basket lined with silk or velvet. The basket was sealed, sometimes even locked, and carried by a trusted servant known as the Sofra Chibasha, the head of table service. But even before the food reached the Sultan's chamber, a taster, typically a eunuch trained in both cuisine and poison detection, sampled each dish. This was not paranoia. This was palace protocol. Sultans had been assassinated before, and food was the most intimate vulnerability of power. A few grains of arsenic in honeyed rice, a drop of belladonna in rose sherbet death could come sweetly. Once approved, the food was delivered through a guarded corridor known as the Golden Road, a narrow private hallway that connected the kitchens to the Sultan's quarters. Lined with tiles and softly lit by oil lamps, this passageway was forbidden to most. Only the most trusted servants, usually eunuchs from the inner palace, could step foot inside. And then, at last, came the meal. Inside his private dining chamber, often a richly decorated room with stained glass windows and mother-of-pearl inlays, the Sultan sat alone before a low circular table known as a sofra. The table was often placed atop fine carpets. He sat cross-legged on cushions of silk and velvet with a linen napkin draped across his lap. Sometimes a silver ewer of rosewater was placed beside him for washing his hands. The atmosphere was hushed. There was no music. No servants lingered. The food spoke, and the Sultan listened. His meal might begin with a warm soup, perhaps a rich chicken broth laced with barley and lemon juice. Then came the heart of the meal, grilled meat, spiced pilafs, stewed vegetables, fish from the Bosphorus, roasted quail eggplant stuffed with lamb and pine nuts, rice simmered with saffron, yogurt chilled in porcelain, breads still steaming from the oven. The Sultan did not use a fork, only a spoon, and often his hands. This was a world where ritual was built into the body itself. Dessert was never skipped. Even in the harshest political climates, the Sultan would end with sweetness. Rose-flavored puddings, honey-drenched pastries, sherbets infused with violet petals or sour cherries. Sweets weren't just indulgence, they were balance believed to calm the humors and settle the soul. Afterward, coffee was brought a ritual of its own. The kavechibashu, or chief of coffee, was a role of immense importance. This wasn't a man who simply boiled beans. He performed a ceremony. The copper pot was heated with care, the ground stirred precisely 3 times, the foam preserved like treasure. The coffee was served in a small cup nestled in a filigree holder, often placed on a tray of gold. The Sultan drank in silence, sometimes contemplating decisions of war and peace with each sip. It's important to note, no meal was casual. Even when the Sultan dined modestly, each plate was a performance, and each bite carried meaning. If he sent a dish back untouched, it could signal disapproval not just of the food, but of the kitchen, the servant, or the chef who prepared it. Dismissal, banishment, or worse could follow. A forgotten herb might mean the end of a career. A perfectly cooked roast might earn a promotion. and nobody ever knew for certain which it would be. Over time, some sultans became legendary for their tastes. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was said to adore pilaf laced with almonds and currants. Sultan Murad IV, known for his harsh rule, was fond of powerful spicy dishes and drank coffee and wine in secret, despite his own prohibitions. Sultan Abdul Hamid II in later years became so paranoid that he trusted only 2 men to cook his meals, and even then sometimes refused to eat. But perhaps the most fascinating detail of all is this. The Sultan's meal was never just his. After he finished eating, whatever remained known as Arctic yemek was not discarded. It was carefully collected and distributed to high-ranking servants' guards and even officials. Eating the Sultan's leftovers was considered an honor, a sign of proximity to power. His taste literally passed down the hierarchy of the palace like a sacrament. And so, the ruler of millions who commanded armies and ruled continents ate alone with the weight of the world in his bowl. In those moments of silence, surrounded by scent flavor and danger, he was not just an emperor. He was a man with a hunger no one dared question. To understand the Ottoman Empire, you must taste it. Every empire leaves a signature. Rome gave the world roads, Egypt left pyramids, and the Ottomans, well, they cooked. Their food wasn't just fuel for the court, it was a declaration. A plate of pilaf whispered conquest. A drizzle of rose syrup sang of trade routes. A piece of baklava told stories of silk war and seduction. Ottoman cuisine wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, calculated and deeply symbolic. Let us begin with what lay at the heart of almost every imperial meal: rice. Not just any rice, but pilav, a delicate aromatic dish that seemed simple on the surface, yet required perfect timing, temperature, and patience. The Ottomans didn't boil their rice into mush. Each grain stood separate, glistening with clarified butter sadiyah, often infused with saffron for a golden hue. But pilaf was a canvas. It might be laced with currants and pine nuts for sweetness, or served plain beside rich stews. On celebratory occasions, it was layered with shreds of lamb, almond slivers, cinnamon, and even roasted chestnuts. For the Sultan, it wasn't just food, it was an edible tapestry. Then came the meats. The Ottoman love affair with lamb was legendary. From whole lambs roasted on spits during public festivals to tender cuts stewed with quince and apricots for royal banquets, lamb reigned supreme. It was believed to be noble meat, clean, honorable halal. Kebabs in the palace were not the street food we know today. They were refined lamb minced with cinnamon cloves and crushed coriander, then skewered and grilled over cherry wood fires for a subtly sweet aroma. Some versions were wrapped in vine leaves. Others were glazed with pomegranate molasses. Each variation told a regional story, Aleppo, Damascus, Konya, Cairo, all woven into one imperial kitchen. Stuffed dishes, or dolma, were another pillar of palace cuisine. The Ottomans believed that filling something grape leaves, eggplants, zucchinis, or even apples transformed it. Inside, you'd find spiced rice, minced meats, pine nuts, herbs, and sometimes dried fruits. The combination was both savory and sweet, and crunchy, warm, and aromatic. To the Ottomans, this was balance, harmony, a philosophical approach to food itself. And then there were soups, not the thin broths of peasants, but luxurious velvety creations made with roasted bones simmered for hours. One favorite was toiga, a yogurt-based soup thickened with wheat and chickpeas, flavored with mint and garlic. Another, iskembe çorbası, was a bold tripe soup often served after long nights or religious fasting, restorative, pungent, and surprisingly beloved. In palace kitchens, soups were the opening act, subtle, warming, respectful. a culinary handshake before the feast began. But no discussion of Ottoman cuisine is complete without its spices. This empire did not simply cook, it scented layered and perfumed. The spice racks of Topkapi were treasure vaults. Saffron brought in delicate threads from Iran, and cashmere was worth its weight in gold. Just a pinch gave dishes their royal golden hue. Cinnamon arrived in bundles from Ceylon cloves, from Zanzibar nutmeg, and mace from the Spice Islands. Sumac, with its tangy edge, came from Anatolia. Cumin, coriander, and anise were woven through savory dishes like a second skin. These weren't just for taste, they were politics in powdered form. The Ottomans controlled vast swaths of the spice trade, and with every feast, they reminded guests of that dominance. When a visiting envoy from Venice or Persia dined in Istanbul, the spices were laid on thick. They were a message: we own the roots. We own the flavor. You eat what we allow. And in contrast to the richness of spices came the herbs which lent freshness. Mint, parsley, dill, and thyme were used liberally. They were chopped fine, tossed into rice, folded into yogurt, sprinkled on stews. Mint with yogurt in particular was a classic Ottoman pairing, cool and clean against the heat of roasted meats. But the real trick of Ottoman cooking wasn't abundance, it was balance. The sweet and the sour, the rich and the light. You might taste lamb braised in sour cherry juice or chicken stewed with apricots and onions. This contrast was everywhere in flavor, color, texture. Even their legendary eggplant dishes reflected this. Imam Bayilda. The Imam fainted was one such creation: eggplant stuffed with onion, garlic, and tomatoes, then simmered in olive oil until melting. Legend says the dish was so delicious, a holy man passed out after one bite. Then came condiments, many of which were invented or perfected in the palace kitchens. Pomegranate molasses was not just a syrup, it was a statement, sharp and sweet, drizzled over roasted vegetables or grilled meats. Garlic yogurt sauces, tahini-based dips, and fruit compotes provided depth and elegance. Bread, though humble, was ever present. Fluffy white loaves for the elite, coarser wheat for officials, and even flatbreads flavored with nigella seeds or brushed with egg yolk for color. Bread was used to scoop food wrap grilled meats or soak up sauces. To leave bread uneaten was considered disrespectful, even sacrilegious. And all of this, remember, was cooked in kitchens that had no electricity, no gas, no modern refrigeration, just fire instinct and generations of perfected memory. These weren't just meals, they were performances. When the Sultan dined, he didn't simply eat. He tasted empire. He consumed history. Every grain of rice had crossed deserts. Every lamb had been hand-picked from Anatolian pastures. Every spice had ridden on camel caravans or sailed across stormy seas. The palace table was a map of the world, and the Sultan at its center ruled not only with swords and decrees, but with a spoon in hand. To outsiders, the harem was a place of mystery, an exotic dream cloaked in fantasy and forbidden beauty. It was imagined as a pleasure palace full of silk-clad women lounging on cushions, waiting for the Sultan's favor. But the truth was far more complex and far more powerful. The harem was the political and emotional core of the palace, and at the center of this hidden world, food played a role as delicate, strategic, and dangerous as any sword. The harem of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Topkapi Palace, housed hundreds of women, the Sultan's mother, the powerful Valide Sultan, his wives and concubines, female relatives, and an entire staff of female servants and eunuchs. While these women lived secluded from the outside world, their influence could shape dynasties, sway political decisions, and determine the fate of the empire. And their meals, though seemingly private and domestic, were subtle battlegrounds of power, hierarchy, and survival. Unlike the grand public rituals of the Sultan's table, The meals inside the harem were intimate, often solitary affairs. Most women dined within their own private chambers or in small groups with other women of similar rank. There were no large communal banquets, at least not without significant meaning. Seating arrangements, what dishes were served, and how food was shared were all carefully watched and interpreted. For the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, and arguably the most powerful woman in the empire, meals were an extension of her authority. She had her own private kitchen staff, separate from the kushan and the general palace kitchens. Her dishes were luxurious and refined, with an emphasis on balance and medicinal qualities. The Valide Sultan often observed dietary principles rooted in Unani medicine, believed to preserve youth and regulate inner harmony. She might start her day with warm milk infused with saffron or clove, followed by lentil soup enriched with garlic, cumin, and olive oil. Her midday meal could include fragrant pilaf layered with almonds, raisins, and cinnamon paired with roasted lamb marinated in yogurt and herbs. Fruit, especially pomegranates and figs, were eaten in season and thought to purify the blood. Below the Valide Sultan were the Khadan's official wives and Iqbal's favored concubines. Their meals were similar in style, but slightly less grand. Yet the differences were noticeable. A slightly smaller tray, one less fruit, fewer sweets. In the harem, food was hierarchy made edible. But the women of the harem weren't passive consumers. They were participants, sometimes even manipulators of what came into their rooms. Certain dishes could signal a request. A plate of sweet pastries might be sent from one woman to another as a token of peace. A shared bowl of stuffed grape leaves could be a secret sign of alliance. Conversely, rejecting a dish, especially a sweet gift, was considered an insult. It could spark rivalry, sow distrust, or even ruin reputations. Sometimes meals served more sinister purposes. Rumors have long swirled around poisoned sherbets or drugged sweets making their way into a rival's chamber. While such tales may have been exaggerated or fueled by European imaginations, the possibility was real enough that the most powerful women often had their own tasters, just like the Sultan. And like the Sultan, they understood that what one eats could save or end a life. The food itself, however, was extraordinary. The harem kitchens prepared dishes with the same care and precision as the imperial kitchens. The use of aromatics and floral ingredients was especially popular among the women. Lavender, rosewater, orange blossom, and musk were not only used in perfumes, but also infused into desserts, sherbets, and even stews. A favorite treat was gulas, a delicate layered dessert made of thin starch sheets soaked in milk and rose water, sprinkled with pomegranate seeds and crushed pistachios. It was light, beautiful, and ephemeral, much like the power structure inside the harem itself. Meals were also deeply seasonal and symbolic. During Ramadan, for example, the fast was broken with great ceremony. The Valide Sultan would host small iftar gatherings in her quarters, inviting select women to share in the meal. These events were both spiritual and political. The dishes served dates, lentil soup, burek grilled meats, and sweet puddings were as much about religious devotion as they were about reinforcing alliances. Afterward, sherbets made with lemon, tamarind, or hibiscus cooled the body and refreshed the soul. The women also had access to some of the most luxurious ingredients in the empire: candied violets, wild honey from Anatolia, saffron from Persia, pistachios from Gaziantep, and sugar imported from Egypt. These ingredients weren't just indulgences, they were gifts of empire, proof of the Sultan's reach and generosity. To serve such things in one's private quarters was to whisper, "I am favored. I am close to the throne." Among the younger women or lower-ranking concubines, meals were simpler but still elegant. A bowl of rice with a drizzle of butter lentil soup some stewed vegetables with sumac, and a piece of fruit. These women often dined in pairs or small groups. Their conversations hushed, their glances meaningful. They watched each other carefully. Who received better food? Whose dish had more saffron? Who had been sent a sweet by the Valid Sultan's kitchen? These details could predict future favor or future exile. In this world of scented oils, embroidered cushions, and polished marble, every meal was a performance, and every bite a test. Perhaps most fascinating of all was the way food and storytelling merged in the harem. After a meal, women might recline with a bowl of nuts or candied fruit, sipping coffee slowly while exchanging gossip, memories, or poetry. Some would read aloud from romances or holy texts. Others would recount palace news, who was seen near the Sultan's chambers, which consort had received a new dress, which cook had been dismissed. In these quiet, post-meal hours, politics unfolded behind smiles and rivalries, sharpened behind laughter. And of course, there were celebrations. When a concubine was chosen by the Sultan, her chamber would be flooded with perfumes, jewels, and food. Sweet pastries, roasted birds, stuffed with nuts, and rice sherbets, dyed bright with fruit and flowers. The feast was not for her alone. It was a message to the rest of the harem. Her rise meant someone else's fall, and the food, once again, was the vehicle. Even in the darkest corners of the harem, where ambitious women plotted and prayed, the scent of cinnamon and clove would linger in the air, like a reminder this empire was built not only on conquest and war, but on flavor, fragrance, and ritual. And as the candles burned low, and the women whispered under silk covers, their stomachs full and their minds racing, one thing was certain. In the Ottoman harem, a meal was never just a meal. It was a whisper of ambition, a taste of power, and a tool as sharp as any blade. Before the roar of cannons, before the rustle of royal robes, or the murmur of court intrigue, there was a quieter, deeper ritual that pulsed through the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The act of drinking. Not in taverns or banquet halls, not with wine goblets or beer steins, but in tiny handleless cups of thick, dark liquid, bitter as judgment, smooth as poetry. Coffee and tea in the Ottoman court were not beverages. They were experiences wrapped in etiquette, draped in silk, and layered with meaning. A single cup could signal trust, alliance, seduction, or betrayal. And for the Sultan, his family, and the elite of Topkapi Palace, these drinks were served not casually, but ceremonially, in a world where even the steam rising from a porcelain rim was charged with significance. The arrival of coffee. A drink fit for empire. Coffee arrived in the Ottoman world in the early 1500s, traveling north from Yemen and Ethiopia, following Sufi mystics and merchants. Originally consumed for its invigorating effects during late-night prayer sessions, it quickly caught the attention of the palace elite. By the mid-16th century, coffee had become a royal obsession, so much so that the Ottoman court created a new official title, Kahveci Basha, or Chief of Coffee. This was not a barista. This was a trusted courtier, a master of ceremony, a handler of secrets. He brewed, served, and presented coffee to the Sultan himself, and was often privy to private moments no one else could witness. His loyalty had to be absolute, his craft flawless. The preparation of coffee in the palace was an art form. The beans, almost always from Yemen, were roasted over gentle heat, then pounded into a fine powder using bronze mortars. The water drawn from the purest palace wells was added to the coffee in a long-handled chesve, usually made of copper or silver. The mixture was heated slowly over hot embers, never boiled, until a rich foam formed on the surface. The foam was essential. A cup without foam was a failed cup, unworthy of the Sultan's lips. It was then poured not in haste, but with care into small porcelain cups known as fincan, often nested in filigree holders made of gold or mother of pearl. The cups were served on trays, accompanied by a glass of cool water, and sometimes a sweet like a piece of lokum or candied fruit. And then came the moment of silence. The power of silence. In the palace, coffee was not drunk with conversation. It was sipped in silence. The act of drinking was meditative, like a prayer. The silence allowed one to focus on the richness of the brew, the warmth of the cup, the subtle hint of cardamom or clove, the way the liquid clung to the tongue. In the harem, this silence took on even more meaning. When coffee was served among women, whether between rivals or allies, it became a dance of restraint and subtlety. Who served whom? Who finished their cup? Who left it untouched? These details spoke louder than words. In a world where direct confrontation was dangerous, coffee was language. And for the Sultan himself, coffee was more than pleasure, it was precision. He often drank it alone, or in the company of his most trusted advisor. The Kavechibesha would bring the trebao low and retreat in silence. The Sultan would then think, and sometimes decide. Wars were not declared over coffee, but they were certainly contemplated. Tea arrives. A lighter ritual. A changing time. While coffee had long been the dark heart of Ottoman drinking culture, tea slowly emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly during the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II. As trade expanded with the Caucasus China, and later British-controlled India, black tea became more common in the palace and among the urban elite. But unlike coffee, tea was a social drink. It was lighter, more delicate, more forgiving. It invited conversation. It was often brewed strong and served with sugar cubes poured into tulip-shaped glasses that allowed the drinker to admire its amber hue. Tea became a staple of mid-morning and late-afternoon gatherings among the palace staff scholars, and eventually the harem as well. Still in Topkapi, coffee remained king, especially in the realm of ceremony. The tools of ritual. In the palace, everything about drinking, whether coffee or tea, was elevated. The trays were inlaid with jade coral and tortoise shell. The cup holders were engraved with verses of poetry. Some trays even had tiny bell attachments that chimed when lifted, announcing the approach of refreshment like a gentle herald. Servants were trained not only in brewing, but in presentation posture, how to bow, how to hold the tray level, how to avoid eye contact when necessary. In the harem, young concubines were often taught the coffee ritual as part of their training, how to impress a superior, how to serve with elegance, how to hide nerves behind practiced grace. Sometimes serving coffee was a test. A woman's poise while presenting the drink might be her silent audition for favor. In love rituals, it was common for a young woman to prepare coffee for a visiting suitor, or even the Sultan. If she added salt instead of sugar, it meant rejection, a playful, subtle form of dismissal. If she prepared it perfectly, it signaled potential, aromas, additions, and sweet accompaniments. While purists believed true Turkish coffee needed no additions in the palace, creativity was encouraged so long as it was refined. Spices like cardamom, cinnamon, clove, and even a pinch of ambergris might be added for aroma and depth. In the harem, floral infusions were more common. Rosewater violet essence or orange blossom might scent the cup. Some sultans were known to favor mastic, a tree resin, with a piney, bittersweet taste, believed to aid digestion and calm the mind. Sweet treats were often served alongside, not just for balance, but as symbols of generosity. Lokum, Turkish delight, candied nuts, dried apricots stuffed with cream, and small pastries like şekerpare semolina cakes soaked in syrup were common companions. And then there were the sherbets, cold fruit-based drinks made with sugar, and flower waters served in jeweled crystal glasses. These were especially favored during hot months, or after meals cooling the body and spirit alike. Hidden messages in a cup. One of the most fascinating aspects of coffee culture in the Ottoman court was fortune-telling. Known as kahve falu, this practice involved reading the coffee grounds left in a finished cup. After the drinker finished their coffee, they would turn the cup upside down on its saucer and let it cool. The patterns formed by the grounds were interpreted by a skilled reader, often a servant or older woman in the harem. While not an official palace practice, kahve falu was deeply woven into daily life, especially among the women. It was a moment of intimacy, curiosity, and sometimes subtle manipulation. A well-timed fortune could suggest favor from the Sultan or hint at an upcoming change in the harem hierarchy. It gave women a sense of insight, perhaps even control, in a world where so much was hidden. The coffee after midnight. In times of stress or sleeplessness, coffee became a companion to solitude. During Ramadan, coffee was served after the fast, often late into the night, keeping the body alert for prayer and the soul anchored in reflection. During moments of mourning or tension in the palace, coffee was brewed quietly. In corners shared between a mother and daughter, a servant and friend, its presence brought calm. Its ritual gave shape to moments that had none. Even as the Ottoman Empire declined and new powers rose, coffee remained silent, steaming timeless. It had outlived sultans, witnessed revolutions, and outlasted wars. In the cafes of Istanbul, in the shadows of crumbling walls, in the stillness of former harems turned into museums, its scent still lingers. In the end, a sip of empire. So much of the Ottoman world was grand wars, palaces, processions titles. But their true power often lay in the quietest moments. A spoon swirling in silence, a cup raised without a word, a breath taken over bitter foam. To drink coffee in the Ottoman court was not just to enjoy a beverage. It was to engage in ritual, to communicate in code, to participate in the theater of empire. And to share tea among silken robes and velvet drapes was not merely hospitality. It was diplomacy, courtship, and survival. Even now, centuries later, when you lift a small cup of thick Turkish coffee to your lips, you're echoing the gestures of sultans, concubines, eunuchs, and poets, all of them united in one simple sacred act. The first sip of silence. In the Ottoman Empire, sweetness was far more than a final course. It was a message, a symbol, and often a weapon of diplomacy. In the heart of Topkapi Palace, deep within its maze of kitchens, lay the Helvahon, the royal house of halva. But this place didn't just produce halva. It was a magical world where sugar nuts, fruit, and flower water were transformed into edible treasures by the hands of elite confectioners known as the helvacha. The air here didn't carry the scent of roasting meats like the rest of the palace kitchens. Instead, it was perfumed with rosewater toasted almonds, cinnamon, and orange blossom. These chefs worked in copper cauldrons, stirring syrupy mixtures with long wooden paddles, while assistants ground pistachios and walnuts into fragrant pastes and poured molten sugar over candied fruits. Every creation was more than a treat. It was a statement of wealth, grace, and imperial power. The queen of Ottoman sweets was without question baklava, made from ultra-thin layers of phyllo dough, sometimes up to 100. In a single tray, it was brushed with butter, filled with chopped pistachios or walnuts, baked to golden perfection, then soaked in lemony syrup or perfumed sugar infused with rose or orange blossom. During Ramadan, a massive ceremonial procession known as the baklava alaya would deliver trays of this royal dessert to the janissaries, reinforcing loyalty and unity through sweetness. Yet baklava wasn't the only jewel in the Ottoman dessert crown. Lokum, or Turkish delight, was another beloved creation made from sugar and starch, boiled and stirred until it became soft and chewy. Flavored with rose lemon mint or mastic, and often dusted in powdered sugar, or rolled in coconut and crushed nuts, lokum was the sweet of elegance. In the harem, it was often served with coffee on golden trays, passed among women in quiet, graceful rituals. One cube could be an invitation, an apology, or a token of affection. Halva, on the other hand, carried spiritual weight. Whether made from flour semolina or tahini halva, was the dessert of ceremonies. It marked weddings, births, deaths, and days of religious reflection. When a sultan died, vats of halva were prepared and given to mourners as both comfort and tradition. But not all Ottoman sweets were dense or heavy. Fruits played a starring role too. Apples were cored and stuffed with nuts and syrup. Quince was poached until ruby red. Melons were hollowed out and filled with chilled yogurt or sweet rice. Even the simplest peach, when soaked in rose syrup, became a dessert fit for royalty. Alongside these treats were the famed sherbets, not frozen desserts, but cold drinks made from fruit juices, herbs, flower essences, and sugar. Served in crystal glasses, sherbets were as refined as wine, but with Islamic elegance. Pomegranate for strength, violet for mystery, lemon for clarity, cherry for passion. Each sip was poetry in liquid form, and when the palace celebrated, sweets weren't just served, they were staged. During royal weddings, circumcisions, or military victories, sculpted sugar displays, castles, ships, birds. Flowers were constructed like edible art. Sweet jellies flavored with musk and violet were molded into moons and stars. Lakma fried dough balls, soaked in honey, were stacked into golden pyramids. Even the act of serving was a performance. Sweets were arranged with symbolic meaning on trays, engraved with poetry, or studded with jewels. A rose-shaped marzipan hinted at affection. A spiral-shaped pastry signaled eternity. In these moments, dessert spoke in ways words could not. And underlying it all was sugar, not just as an ingredient, but as a sign of empire. It was imported from Egypt, stored in palace warehouses, and carefully measured by officials. In a world of salt fire and conquest, sweetness was the soft power that lingered on the tongue. So in Topkapi Palace, a dessert was never just a dessert. It was memory message celebration, and sometimes a carefully wrapped warning. Even now, when you lift a cube of lokum to your lips, you're tasting a sliver of empire, a whisper from a vanished world where sweetness ruled alongside scepters and swords. Inside the opulent halls of Topkapi Palace, where gold shimmered on domes and delicate scents drifted from copper pots. Food was never just food. It was faith woven into every bite, every recipe, and every kitchen ritual. For the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic state at its core, religious law didn't merely influence daily life, it guided it. The Quran, the Hadith, and centuries of Islamic tradition shaped not only how the Sultan ruled, but how he dined, how his meals were prepared, and even how his leftovers were treated. Halal, the Arabic word meaning permissible, was the foundation of the imperial table. It governed every stage of consumption, from the selection of ingredients to the methods of slaughter, from who touched the food to how it was served. In the kitchens of the palace, this meant that every cook, server, butcher, and taster followed rules not only of culinary excellence, but of spiritual discipline. The animals served to the Sultan, and his court had to be slaughtered according to Islamic principles, with a clean cut to the throat, while invoking the name of God, ensuring that the act was not just physical, but sacred. Any deviation from this method, any question of impurity or improper handling, would render the meat haram forbidden and entirely unfit for the palace. The imperial kitchen had its own religious overseers, a special class of stewards whose sole responsibility was to ensure that no food, no vessel, and no act violated Islamic dietary law. These men inspected deliveries, oversaw slaughterhouses, and regularly cleansed kitchens with ritual precision. Their presence was quiet but powerful, and even the most senior chefs deferred to their authority. Alcohol naturally was banned in theory, but the reality was more complex. Officially, the Sultan and his court were expected to abstain, especially under the strict eyes of Islamic scholars. Yet behind closed doors, some sultans were known to indulge in wine or other forbidden drinks, often in private settings or during special occasions. However, for the kitchens, such behaviors did not alter the rules. Alcohol was not stored, not cooked with, and not allowed to touch the surfaces of the Sultan's table. Instead, other indulgences flourished: sherbet syrups, fruit cordials, and fermented honey drinks that mimicked the celebratory feel of wine without crossing the halal line. In religious observances, the connection between food and faith became even more pronounced. During the holy month of Ramadan, the palace operated on an entirely different rhythm. Meals were no longer served during the day. Instead, after sunset, the first bite of the iftar meal, a tradition that began with a date and water emulating the Prophet Muhammad, was a moment of spiritual gravity. The kitchens would erupt in activity just before sundown, preparing lavish spreads of soups, stuffed vegetables, grilled meats, pilafs, and sweets. Yet even in such grandeur, the first bites remained. Humble olives, date soup bread, reminders of moderation and gratitude. The Sultan himself often chose to break his fast in a manner that reflected simplicity, eating quietly, and alone, acknowledging the spiritual nature of the month. His iftar meals were often accompanied by verses from the Quran, recited by palace imams, and followed by long stretches of prayer. In the harem, the Valida Sultan and the women of the court also observed Ramadan with devotion. Their fast-breaking meals were intimate, reflective, and filled with traditional dishes passed down through generations. These evenings were not only religious, they were social and emotional gatherings that reminded the women of their place in the broader tapestry of Islamic history. Another significant tradition was the Kurban Bayrama, or Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice. During this holiday, animals were sacrificed in honor of the Prophet Ibrahim's devotion to God. In the palace, hundreds of animals were ritually slaughtered, their meat divided into 3 parts: one for the palace, one for guests and neighbors, and one for the poor. Even the Sultan participated not directly with a knife, but through ritual gestures that underscored his spiritual leadership. The kitchens were filled with lamb stews, roasted meats, and celebratory dishes, but always with a consciousness of the sacred. Every dish served during Bayram had a meaning, a connection to sacrifice charity and divine mercy. In daily life, cleanliness was another crucial religious aspect of Ottoman cuisine. The Prophet's teachings emphasized hygiene, and so did the palace. Chefs washed their hands constantly. Slaughterhouses were cleaned according to strict schedules, and kitchen utensils were often reserved for specific food types to avoid contamination. Leftover food was never wasted. It was either redistributed among the lower-ranking palace staff or donated to nearby soup kitchens. Feeding the poor was not charity, it was duty. Even the Sultan's untouched dishes were carefully preserved and passed down the court hierarchy as a symbolic act of sharing the blessings bestowed upon the empire. Furthermore, mealtime was bracketed by prayer. Before a meal, it was customary to say, Bismillah, invoking the name of God. After eating Alhamdulillah, a phrase of thanks was spoken. These weren't formalities. They were part of the rhythm of life, reminders that the act of eating was a gift, and that every bite carried spiritual weight. In addition to halal laws, many palace dishes were designed according to the principles of Unani medicine, a system deeply intertwined with Islamic culture. Dishes were categorized by their hot or cold properties, and meals were balanced to maintain harmony within the body. Certain ingredients were believed to benefit the heart, calm the nerves, or purify the blood. Sultans with digestive issues or insomnia had special menus designed by palace physicians in collaboration with senior chefs. A bowl of lentil soup might not just be nourishment, it might be medicine. Rosewater mint vinegar and honey weren't just flavorings, they were healing agents. Through this lens, cooking in the Ottoman palace became a sacred practice, a merging of body and soul, matter and spirit. And in times of crisis, food played its role in spiritual reassurance. During plagues, droughts, or wars, the palace increased its charitable food production. Huge cauldrons of soup were prepared for the people of Istanbul. Rice and bread were distributed from palace stores. These acts weren't just political, they were religious duties, expressions of mercy, and manifestations of the Sultan's divine responsibility. For all its grandeur, the Ottoman table was shaped as much by restraint as by indulgence. The glittering trays, the jeweled cups, the perfumed dishes, they all served a deeper order, an Islamic rhythm that pulsed beneath the marble floors and golden ceilings. To eat in Topkapi Palace was not merely to enjoy luxury. It was to partake in divine order, to acknowledge boundaries set by heaven, to show discipline in the face of abundance, and to turn every act of eating into a quiet moment of worship. Even centuries later, as the empire faded and the world modernized, this deep connection between food and faith remained one of the most enduring legacies of the Ottoman court. Because in that palace, surrounded by conquest poetry, power, and politics, the most profound acts often came not with a sword, but with a spoon raised slowly in reverence. In the vast and intricate world of the Ottoman palace, where time flowed to the rhythm of prayer and protocol, the kitchens were not only places of cooking, but of careful planning, adaptation, and preservation. To feed an entire empire, especially its royal household, was not merely a daily task. It was a year-round operation that required foresight, discipline, and mastery over nature's rhythms. The empire was vast, stretching from the cold mountains of the Balkans to the sun-soaked deserts of Arabia, and the kitchens of Topkapi Palace had access to ingredients from every corner of it. But even with such abundance, seasons mattered. There were no refrigerators, no artificial preservatives, no industrial packaging, and so the imperial kitchen had to master the art of preserving time, of capturing spring in jars, autumn in oils, and summer in sweets, so the Sultan and his court could dine on the world even when the trees were bare and the markets silent. The process began with organization. Within the palace kitchen complex, vast storerooms known as amberhain were built like fortresses, cool stone-walled chambers with high ceilings, ventilation slits, and thick wooden doors. Inside, grains were stored in massive bins, wheat, barley, rice, lentils, and chickpeas, each in their own designated area. These staples formed the base of many meals and could be preserved for years if kept dry and free from pests. Clay pots, sealed with wax, lined the walls filled with olive oil from the Aegean coast, grape molasses from Anatolia, and vinegar from Thrace. Honey, a critical ingredient in many desserts and sauces, was stored in large earthenware jars, often submerged in sand pits to maintain a steady temperature. Sugar imported mainly from Egypt was weighed, cataloged, and stored under lock and key. It was as valuable as silver. Then came the fruits and vegetables. At the peak of each season, palace stewards made note of what was fresh and abundant in the markets of Istanbul. Apricots in early summer, figs in late summer, quince in autumn, pomegranates just before winter. These were brought to the kitchens in bulk and immediately processed. Some were dried figs, apricots, grapes, and dates were carefully arranged on reed mats and sun-dried before being packed into woven baskets or clay jars. Others were preserved in syrup or honey. Pears, apples, and quinces were peeled, simmered in sugar, and sealed in glass jars that sparkled like gemstones on the palace shelves. Even citrus peels were candied, and stored lemons, oranges, and bitter Seville fruits, sliced thin and soaked in rosewater-infused syrup. These preserved fruits served as both dessert and decoration, often brought out during winter feasts when fresh fruit was scarce. Vegetables were handled with equal care. Eggplants, peppers, and tomatoes, especially prized in summer, were roasted, peeled, and layered with olive oil in large jars. Olives were brined in sea salt and vinegar, then packed into ceramic crocks. Grape leaves essential for making dolma were blanched and pressed between layers of salt before being stored in clay pots for later use. Cabbage and turnips were fermented into pickles turshoo, which lined the shelves in bright acidic colors. The pickling process was not just about taste, but survival. It allowed the palace to maintain a supply of vegetables even in the harshest months. Meat posed a different challenge. While fresh lamb and beef were available most of the year game, and poultry were more seasonal. Ducks and quails were hunted in spring, and wild boar in colder months for those who ate beyond strict halal boundaries. These meats were salted, dried, and smoked in special chambers, creating a kind of Ottoman charcuterie. Fish, too, was preserved, especially mackerel bonito and anchovies. They were cleaned, layered with salt, and stored in large barrels known as lakurda, a technique inherited from Byzantine times. Butter made from sheep or cow's milk was clarified into sadaya ghee-like fat that could last for months without spoiling. This clarified butter was a foundation of palace cooking and was kept in large copper tins, ready to be melted and brushed onto pastries, meats, or vegetables. Cheese, another vital staple, came in many forms and was aged in caves or earthen pots. Some cheeses were brined and eaten fresh. Others were smoked, hardened, or packed in herbs to extend shelf life. Even water had its cycles. The palace used ice pits, or karkuyusu, to store snow collected from nearby mountains. During the winter months, workers packed snow into deep stone wells insulated with straw. The ice would last into the hot summer, allowing the Sultan and his court to enjoy chilled drinks, cold desserts, or even fresh fish brought up from the cellars with the cool breath of distant winter still clinging to its skin. Storage wasn't just practical, it was political. The ability to serve a perfectly ripened fig in December or a preserved cherry in February was a demonstration of control, foresight, and abundance. It reassured visitors that the empire lacked nothing, that the Sultan's reach extended not just across land, but across time itself. To guests from Europe or Persia, the array of preserved foods was a marvel. A dessert of dried apricots rehydrated in syrup and served with rose cream could carry a story of orchards in the eastern provinces and the labor of hundreds. A simple bowl of pickled cabbage might represent a successful harvest 3 seasons earlier. Behind each bite was an empire of farmers, traders, cooks, and scribes, all working in harmony to serve the Sultan's next meal. And the record-keeping was just as rigorous. The imperial kitchens maintained vast ledgers, tracking the inflow and outflow of goods. How many kilos of rice were used in a week? How much honey was spent on desserts in Ramadan? How many sheep were slaughtered for the circumcision feast of a prince? These logs weren't just accounting. They were proof of power. They showed that the palace anticipated need, respected seasons, and left nothing to chance. There was also a cultural dimension to this seasonal awareness. Certain dishes were expected at specific times of year. In spring, fresh herbs and greens dominated the table. In summer, grilled vegetables and cold yogurt dishes offered relief from the heat. In autumn, stews grew thicker and spices more pronounced. Winter meals were heavier, featuring dried legumes, fatty meats, and plenty of pickles to balance the richness. The palace menu flowed with the earth, and yet, through all of this, the Ottomans showed restraint. Preserving didn't mean hoarding. It meant respect. Respect for harvest, for time, and for the people who labored to bring these gifts to the palace. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were redistributed. Peels and scraps became compost or food for animals. Even the ashes from the cooking fires were saved to make soap or clean the copper pots. The palace was a place of grandeur, but also of deep order. This balance of beauty and efficiency, of luxury and pragmatism, defined the empire's longevity. Because behind every steaming dish of lamb and rice, every bowl of candied quince, every sip of lemon sherbet on a hot summer day, there was a network of storage rooms. Clay jars, straw-packed barrels, and stone-paved cellars humming quietly beneath the surface, reminding all who entered that the empire did not simply feast. It planned, preserved, and honored the cycles of the world. And in doing so, it turned the passage of time into an art form, one that could be tasted in every season of the Sultan's eternal table, beneath the domes of Topkapi Palace. Beyond the throne room's courtyards and shadowed chambers of intrigue, there was a different kind of brotherhood. Quiet, disciplined, invisible, in the court records, yet utterly essential to the beating heart of empire. They were not warriors, viziers, or poets. They were chefs, the men who cooked not just for survival or pleasure, but for power, prestige, ritual, and rhythm. In the imperial kitchens of the Ottoman court, chefs were more than craftsmen. They were gatekeepers of tradition, keepers of knowledge passed down, not through ink and paper, but through hands, eyes, tongues, and memory. To be a palace chef was to belong to a hidden hierarchy, a strict meritocracy, where talent was everything, and silence was survival. The path to the royal kitchen began early. Many of the boys who entered the palace kitchens were devshirme recruits. Young Christian boys, taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the empire. Others were sons of trusted palace staff or apprentices from culinary guilds in Istanbul. They entered the kitchens as odabaşı, or shakird kitchen boys, tasked with carrying water, cleaning floors, or tending fires. They learned by watching, not asking. Observation was their education. Speaking out of turn could get them beaten, dismissed, or worse. The imperial kitchen was divided into dozens of sections, each responsible for a different category of food. The ashain for soups and stews, the pilavhon for rice dishes, the helvahane for sweets, the balakon for fish, the çorbahon for broths, and the kushan, the sacred inner kitchen that prepared meals solely for the Sultan. Each unit was run by a master chef or usta, whose authority was unquestioned. These ustas had risen through the ranks after decades of service, and they carried in their minds the measurements, techniques, and instinctive timings that no book could teach. Recipes were never written down. They were memorized, internalized, and refined. A handful of saffron, a ladle of broth, a 3-minute simmer. These chefs didn't work with timers or thermometers. They cooked by feel, taste, and smell, developing a sixth sense that separated them from ordinary cooks. But skill alone wasn't enough. A royal chef needed discipline, discretion, and above all, loyalty. The food that passed through their hands would enter the mouth of the Sultan himself. A mistake wasn't just a bad dish, it was a security risk. As such, chefs in the kushan underwent intense vetting. Their families were scrutinized, their loyalties tested, their movements tracked. Once inside, they lived like monks, no wives, no contact with outsiders, no unnecessary conversation. Their lives were tied to their cauldrons, knives, and trays. And yet, there was pride. Immense, quiet pride. Being selected to work in the kushan was the highest culinary honor in the empire. These chefs prepared the Sultan's daily rice pilaf, his grilled meats, his yogurt soups, and his desserts. They knew the ruler's palate better than his physician. They could sense his mood by his appetite. A missing appetite meant political tension. A second helping meant satisfaction. A returned tray untouched could signal danger. Over time, certain chefs became legendary within palace walls. One such figure was Mehmet Usta, said to have created a lamb dish so perfectly balanced in spice and sweetness that it became the Sultan's comfort food during wartime. Another was Ali Halvatsi, a confectioner known for his rose-scented helva, whose hands reportedly never shook even in old age. These men were never mentioned in the annals of battle or treaties, but their legacy lived on in whispers, in secret techniques passed to a single apprentice before retirement. Their art was ephemeral, consumed and forgotten in the moment, yet vital. For every grand banquet, there were dozens of chefs working from dawn till midnight, roasting, slicing, stewing, kneading. Their tools were extensions of themselves, copper pots seasoned with decades of use, wooden spoons darkened by flame knives, sharpened with near religious care. Fire was their canvas, steam their ink. And when dignitaries from Persia, France, or Venice arrived, it was these chefs who shaped the empire's first impression, not soldiers, not scribes. A perfectly plated quince, stuffed with lamb and glazed in pomegranate molasses, spoke louder than a dozen speeches. A tray of baklava, still warm and glistening with syrup, could melt suspicion. A cup of strong coffee paired with candied rose petals could seal a treaty. Yet their work came with dangers. The kitchens were hot, crowded, and intense. Burns were common, cuts inevitable. The fear of poisoning was ever present. At least one taster stood between the chef and the Sultan sampling dishes for toxins. And though rare chefs had been executed when suspicions arose, to serve poorly seasoned stew to a moody sultan could mean banishment. To forget an ingredient in a religious feast might lead to disgrace. One of the greatest ironies of the palace was that while everyone feared the Grand Vizier's tongue, the Sultan's chefs feared his silence. If the ruler said nothing during a meal, tension ran high. Praise was rare, but when it came, even a simple nod or the request for seconds could elevate a chef's name to near mythic status among his peers. The chefs lived modestly within the palace walls, their quarters located near the kitchens, but far from the chambers of power. Their only reward was more work. Yet they were part of a system larger than themselves, a culinary machine that ran for centuries without fail. They trained others often from childhood, repeating motions 1,000 times until precision became instinct. A boy might spend 2 years only washing rice. Another might be taught to fold dough for a single pastry. Mastery was slow, deliberate, and sacred. What they lacked in fame, they earned in permanence. Because while ministers came and went, and even sultans were overthrown, the recipes remained. The method of marinating lamb overnight in yogurt and garlic, the ratio of lemon to sugar in sherbet, the precise number of phyllo layers in baklava, these traditions outlived dynasties. And beyond technique, these men cultivated a philosophy. They believed that food could shape emotion, that a meal could soothe anxiety, inspire loyalty, or provoke nostalgia. They understood that in the Ottoman worldview, to feed was to rule. The kitchens were a metaphor for the empire itself, layered, disciplined, harmonious. No one ingredient dominated. No voice shouted. Every flavor had its place. And so the chefs worked in harmony, like an orchestra without applause. Even in moments of solitude, they found meaning. In the quiet stir of a pot, the shine of a polished ladle, the hiss of bread hitting the tandoor, these were their victories. They were artists of the ephemeral. Their masterpieces were devoured, their names forgotten outside palace walls, but their fingerprints remained on history's tongue. Every time the Sultan tasted satisfaction, every time a guest marveled at the imperial cuisine, every time a concubine sighed over a spoonful of pudding, the chefs were there. Invisible, essential, eternal. Centuries have passed since the last Sultan walked the marbled halls of Topkapi Palace, since the great copper cauldrons steamed with lamb stew beneath domed kitchens, since silver trays carried rosewater sherbets and saffron pilaf to the velvet-lined chambers of royalty. Yet the flavors of the Ottoman court have not vanished. They have transformed, evolved, and lingered like ghosts in the kitchens of Istanbul, in the stalls of bustling bazaars, in the homes of Anatolia, and in the restaurants of cities far beyond the empire's original borders. Ottoman cuisine, though no longer tied to the structure of imperial protocol or the rhythm of courtly rituals, remains alive in spirit and form, embedded in the everyday lives of millions. In modern-day Turkey, you don't need to step inside a palace to taste the shadows of an empire. A simple breakfast of olives, feta cheese simit, and sweet cherry preserves carries the DNA of courtly elegance. A bowl of mercimek çorbası or lentil soup mirrors the smooth, delicate broths once ladled for viziers. The humble act of serving tea on a tulip-shaped glass recalls centuries of hospitality practices perfected behind harem curtains. But it's not only the flavors, it's the philosophy that endures. The Ottomans believed that food was a reflection of harmony, balance, and seasonal awareness, and this concept still defines Turkish cooking today. The pairing of sweet and sour of warm spices with cool yogurt of heavy stews, followed by light herb-laced salads, all speak to a culinary logic first orchestrated by palace chefs. In Istanbul's old districts, restaurants inspired by Ottoman traditions serve dishes directly lifted from courtly records. Hunkar beyendi, a silky eggplant puree topped with lamb stew named after a sultan's delight. Mutankana, a dish of lamb stewed with dried fruits and almonds once reserved for special banquets. And zurdi, a rice pudding dyed gold with saffron once considered sacred and festive. These are not modern inventions. They are inheritances carefully preserved through oral tradition, regional memory, and a deep cultural reverence for food as identity. In modern culinary schools across Turkey, chefs now study Ottoman cuisine as a respected and complex discipline. They learn the architecture of multi-layered pilafs, the art of working with rosewater and mastic, and the forgotten techniques of slow cooking in copper pots sealed with dough. Historians and gastronomers have begun to dig through old palace archives, reinterpreting lost recipes for a new generation of diners. Some even attempt to recreate entire imperial feasts, not just for nostalgia, but to understand the social and political function of food in Ottoman society. Restaurants like Asitane in Istanbul go as far as reconstructing menus served to sultans hundreds of years ago using archived records from Topkapi's kitchens. Dishes once thought extinct are now reborn: almond soup with rose petals, quince stuffed with lamb pastries flavored with ambergris and musk. These meals are more than food, they are time machines. Yet the legacy of Ottoman cuisine doesn't stop at Turkey's borders. Through centuries of migration, trade, and conquest, the culinary influence of the empire spread across the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. In Greece, dishes like imam bayıldı and dolma are direct descendants of Ottoman recipes. In the Arab world, kebabs, stuffed vegetables, and yogurt-based sauces reflect centuries of shared culinary history. In the Balkans, borek pastries, pilafs, and sweet baklavas remain central to traditional meals. Even in Central Europe, echoes of Ottoman flavor survive in dishes like goulash and strudels, where spice trade and occupation left subtle but lasting fingerprints. The idea of a grand, spice-rich, perfume-laced cuisine has also influenced global perceptions of Middle Eastern food. Western chefs, food writers, and cookbook authors often turn to Ottoman cuisine as a source of mystery and romance, its complexity, its fusion of East and West, its use of luxurious ingredients, and its poetic way of balancing richness with restraint. But perhaps the most lasting modern legacy of Ottoman dining lies in rituals. The tradition of kahve Turkish coffee continues as a cultural institution, served in tiny cups, brewed slowly, sipped quietly. It is the same ritual once performed by the kahveci basha in the Sultan's private chambers. The act of offering coffee to guests accompanied by a sweet-like Turkish delight remains one of the most sacred gestures of Turkish hospitality. It is a quiet nod to centuries of ceremonial etiquette, a daily act that ties the ordinary person to the royal past. Likewise, Ramadan feasts across the Muslim world still follow patterns refined during the Ottoman-era dates and soup to begin, followed by stews, rice bread, and sweets to close, all shared in a sense of communal blessing. The foods may vary, but the structure, the sacred shape of the meal remains rooted in palace tradition. Even wedding feasts, funeral meals, and circumcision celebrations bear the imprint of Ottoman ceremonial cuisine. In Turkey, the practice of mevlid, preparing food for religious gatherings or in memory of a deceased loved one, often includes dishes such as wheat halva or sweet rice pudding, echoing the Helvahane's old rituals. Meanwhile, modern Turkish homes still preserve the sense of seasonal cooking. Grape leaves are harvested and brined in spring for dolma throughout the year. Tomato sauces are cooked in bulk and stored for winter. Quince and pumpkin desserts dominate autumn menus. This mindfulness toward time, place, and rhythm reflects not just practical knowledge, but a worldview one first cultivated in the royal kitchens of the Ottoman court. Even in language, traces remain. Turkish idioms about food often reflect imperial concepts. To eat from the same spoon means loyalty. To offer the last bite suggests deep affection. To turn someone's soup cold is to ruin their peace. These phrases reveal a culture that sees food not merely as sustenance, but as emotion, trust, and memory. And yet not all of the Ottoman culinary heritage survives in pristine form. Many original recipes were lost, never written down, passed only from ustas to apprentices, and vanished with time. Some ingredients, ambergris, musk. Rare spices are no longer used or even available. Others have been simplified or commercialized to meet modern tastes. But this is not loss, it is evolution. Just as the empire itself changed, fragmented, and gave rise to new nations, so too did its cuisine grow into new forms. In this sense, every pot of lamb stew simmering in a home kitchen, every tray of baklava in a corner bakery, every warm glass of tea handed to a guest in Istanbul, Sarajevo, or Damascus carries within it a fragment of that forgotten world. Ottoman cuisine lives not because it's preserved in museums, but because it's still eaten, still cooked, still shared. It lives in the homes of grandmothers who remember the scent of rose jam simmering in July in the hands of street vendors who fold börek before sunrise in the hearts of chefs who seek to honor the past without freezing it in time. It lives in the steam that rises from a bowl of lentil soup on a cold morning, in the crunch of pistachios between layers of warm pastry, in the clink of a tea glass at sunset. The Sultan is long gone. The Janissaries are no more. The empire has become history. But the table remains. And at that table, whether modest or grand modern or ancient, the flavors still whisper of marble halls, jeweled trays, and hands that once cooked not for glory or fame, but for the ritual of feeding a world. That is the final legacy of Ottoman cuisine, not just a catalog of ingredients, but a way of being in the world where food is reverence memory, and the most enduring expression of empire. Long after the flavors fade, long after the steam disappears from silver trays and the last crumbs of baklava are brushed away, what remains is something deeper, something more lasting than taste itself, memory. Ottoman cuisine was never just about feeding the body. It fed the soul. It was a language, a performance, a ritual, a prayer. It captured joy and grief, longing and pride in the quietest of ways, through a plate of stuffed grape leaves passed between lovers, through a spoonful of halva offered to mourners, through the scent of cardamom rising in a narrow hallway of the harem. What made this cuisine truly imperial was not the wealth of its ingredients, but the depth of feeling baked into every layer, every stir, every drop of rosewater. From the lowest kitchen apprentice to the Sultan himself, everyone who touched the food in the palace participated in something sacred. The cook who rose before dawn to knead dough was not just making bread, he was preserving rhythm. The concubine who brewed coffee for her rival was not simply serving a drink, she was sending a coded message. The mother who made quince preserves in autumn was not only following tradition, she was bottling a season for her grandchildren. Food was the invisible thread that bound people across ranks, beliefs, and generations. In the palace, it marked time. The first sip of sherbet announced spring. The return of roasted chestnuts whispered of winter. Pilaf signaled comfort. Lamb with cinnamon signaled power. Coffee in silence meant something unspeakable had occurred. The empire breathed through its dishes. Each feast told a story. Each story was an archive of unspoken truths. When the Sultan sat down to eat, he wasn't just nourishing himself, he was tasting diplomacy, culture, memory, and belief. His plate was filled with what the farmers grew, what the traders carried, what the cooks transformed, and what the court expected. And the way he responded, what he praised, what he pushed aside, what he asked for, again became a ripple that spread throughout the empire. A favored dish could become national pride. A forgotten one could disappear from kitchens forever. Even more powerful than the Sultan's judgment was the emotional life of the palace, the deep, tender feelings that food stirred beneath the surface. A cook might weep in silence as he stirred the soup that reminded him of a mother he'd never see again. A concubine might clutch a piece of candy sent by the Sultan, reading into it a future she dared not speak aloud. A janissary might taste honeyed almonds and remember the festival of his youth. These moments were quiet, almost invisible, yet they defined the humanity of palace life. No matter how vast the empire, how elaborate the ceremony, what endured were the emotions behind the meal, the memories layered into pastry, the grief folded into dough, the hopes simmered into broth. And beyond the palace, this emotional thread continued. In the towns and villages of the empire, people marked life's most important moments not with speeches, but with dishes. A wedding without sweet rice was incomplete. A funeral without halva was unthinkable. A child's first fast was broken with dates soaked in milk and the applause of a family. A guest's arrival called for tea bread and something sweet, always something sweet. These traditions, inherited from generations of courtly structure, became part of the emotional blueprint of an entire civilization. Even today, this emotional weight of food still shapes the modern Turkish table and the wider Middle Eastern world. A bite of stuffed eggplant might bring someone to tears. A spoonful of rice pudding might recall a grandmother's hands. A scent drifting from a bakery window might stop a passerby in his tracks, not from hunger, but from memory. And perhaps this is the most powerful legacy of Ottoman cuisine, not the glory of royal banquets or the complexity of technique, but the way it lives quietly inside people. The way a flavor can summon a face, the way a spice can unlock a memory, the way food becomes a vessel for the feelings we cannot say aloud. In Topkapi Palace, those feelings moved silently through steaming trays, through whispered recipes, through shared glances across a table set for 200 or just one. And even now, centuries later, when you sit down to a meal made with care, when you sip a bitter coffee in silence, when you serve something sweet to someone you love, you're part of that same tradition. You're part of the empire. Not through crowns or titles, but through feeling. Through the invisible power of food to remember, to connect, and to endure. And so, the Sultan's kitchen lives on, not just in museums or old recipes, but in every human heart that has ever sat in front of a meal and felt without words that they are home. And so, as we close the great doors of the Sultan's kitchen, let us step back and reflect not only on the grandeur of what was cooked, or the precision with which it was served, but on the deeper truth behind it all, that in the Ottoman Empire food was never just food. It was identity. It was memory. It was power wrapped in the aroma of saffron, folded into layers of pastry, whispered through the steam of a simple bowl of soup. Behind every dish there were hands, steady-skilled, unseen. Behind every bite, a story sometimes joyful, sometimes painful, always human. The empire may have crumbled, the palaces may have quieted, but the spirit of those kitchens, the balance, the elegance, the soul still lingers. It lingers in a cup of coffee served with silence, in a sweet offered to a guest, in a recipe passed from grandmother to child, with no measurements, only memory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through flavor's history and the emotional fabric of a vanished world. Until next time, may your meals be warm, your table full, and your heart open to the quiet power of food.